नमस्कार। आज हम एक बहुत ही अहम विषय पर बात कर रहे हैं, नया वेज कोड 2019 और खासकर इसमें मजदूरी या वेतन की परिभाषा कैसे दी गई है।
जी, पहले काफी अलग अलग कानून थे, परिभाषाएं भी कई थी, काफी कंफ्यूजन था।
हाँ बिल्कुल। तो इस नए कोड का एक बड़ा मकसद यही था कि मजदूरी की एक साफ, सिंगल, स्टैंडर्डाइज परिभाषा हो जो सभी 4 लेबर कोड पर लागू हो,
ताकि उलझन कम हो, पारदर्शिता बढ़े।
चलिए तो फिर इसी को समझते हैं, ये क्यों इतना महत्वपूर्ण है।
देखिए, ये सिर्फ कोई किताबी परिभाषा नहीं है। इसका सीधा असर पड़ता है कि किसी कर्मचारी का सैलरी स्ट्रक्चर कैसा होगा, उसका प्रोविडेंट फंड यानी पीएफ कैसे कटेगा, ग्रेच्युटी कितनी बनेगी और हाँ, महीने के आखिर में हाथ में कितनी सैलरी आएगी।
अच्छा, तो अगर हम कोड के हिसाब से चलें तो मजदूरी है क्या? मतलब आसान भाषा में क्या कहेंगे?
यूं समझिए, मजदूरी मतलब हर तरह का पेमेंट, चाहे वो सैलरी हो, भत्ता हो या कुछ और, जिसे पैसे में बता सके, और जो कर्मचारी को उसके काम के लिए मिलता है, जैसा कि उसकी नौकरी की शर्तों में तय हुआ हो।
ठीक है।
और इसमें 3 चीजें तो पक्का शामिल है। पहला, बेसिक पे यानी मूल वेतन।
हाँ।
दूसरा, डियरनेस अलाउंस यानी महंगाई भत्ता।
ओके।
और तीसरा, रिटेनिंग अलाउंस, अगर किसी को मिलता है तो। ये 3 तो समझिए कोर हैं।
ठीक है, ये तो हुई वो चीजें जो मजदूरी हैं, लेकिन कोड कुछ चीजों को इससे बाहर भी रखता है ना?
हाँ, यहीं पे चीजें थोड़ी सी पेचीदा होती हैं। कोड कई भुगतानों को मजदूरी की परिभाषा से बाहर रखता है।
जैसे कि
क्या क्या है इस लिस्ट में? इसमें आता है कोई भी बोनस जो कानून के तहत मिलता है पर वो आपकी नौकरी की शर्तों का हिस्सा न हो।
अच्छा।
फिर मकान किराया भत्ता यानी एचआरए।
हाँ, एचआरए तो कॉमन है।
फिर एम्प्लॉयर का आपके पेंशन या पीएफ में जो योगदान है और उस पर मिलने वाला ब्याज,
वो भी बाहर है।
यहीं पर वो सवाल आता है स्पेशल अलाउंस का। कई सैलरी स्लिप में दिखता है, उसका क्या स्टेटस है? क्या वो बाहर है या अंदर?
देखिए, स्पेशल अलाउंस पर काफी बहस होती है। सिर्फ नाम अलाउंस होने से वो अपने आप बाहर नहीं हो जाता। बात ये है कि अगर आपके अपॉइंटमेंट लेटर या ऑफर लेटर में साफ साफ ये नहीं लिखा है कि ये अलाउंस किसी खास खर्चे की भरपाई के लिए है, जैसे यूनिफॉर्म का खर्चा, तो उसे आमतौर पर मजदूरी का ही हिस्सा माना जाएगा।
अच्छा, मतलब जब तक स्पेसिफिकली एक्सक्लूड ना किया गया हो, वो शामिल ही माना जाएगा।
बिल्कुल, उसे बाहर रखने के लिए ठोस वजह बतानी होगी।
और अब आते हैं उस सबसे जरूरी नियम पर जिसके बारे में इतनी बात हो रही है, वो 50% वाला नियम, पहला परंतुक जिसे कहते हैं। ये क्या है?
हाँ, ये वाकई एक गेम चेंजर जैसा है। कोड में एक शर्त जोड़ी गई है, वो ये कहती है कि ये जो बाहर रखी गई चीजें हैं ना, एचआरए, बोनस, कन्वेंस वगैरह जो हमने अभी गिने, क्लॉज ए से आई तक,
हाँ,
अगर इन सब का टोटल अमाउंट कर्मचारी को मिलने वाले कुल पेमेंट के 50% से ज्यादा हो जाता है,
मतलब आधे से ज्यादा पेमेंट अगर इन्हीं बाहर रखी गई चीजों का,
हाँ, तो जितना अमाउंट उस 50% से ज्यादा है, वो एक्स्ट्रा अमाउंट वापस मजदूरी में जोड़ दिया जाएगा।
ओह, तो मतलब कंपनियां ऐसा नहीं कर सकती कि बेसिक पे बहुत कम दिखा दिया और बाकी सब बत्तों में डाल दिया ताकि पीएफ और ग्रेच्युटी कम कटे।
बिल्कुल सही पकड़ा आपने। ये नियम यही पक्का करता है कि कम से कम आधी सैलरी तो मजदूरी की परिभाषा में आ ही आए, इससे ज्यादा हो सकती है, कम नहीं।
तो इसका असर क्या होगा कर्मचारी के लिए?
इसके 2 पहलू हैं। एक तरफ क्योंकि मजदूरी का बेस बढ़ जाएगा तो पीएफ और ग्रेच्युटी की गणना ज्यादा अमाउंट पर होगी, यानी लॉन्ग टर्म में रिटायरमेंट के समय कर्मचारी को ज्यादा फायदा मिल सकता है।
ये तो अच्छी बात है।
हाँ, लेकिन दूसरी तरफ क्योंकि पीएफ जैसे कॉन्ट्रिब्यूशंस शायद बढ़ जाएं, तो हो सकता है कि कर्मचारी की हर महीने हाथ में आने वाली सैलरी यानी टेक होम सैलरी थोड़ी कम हो जाए।
अच्छा, तो ये एक तरह का ट्रेड ऑफ है।
और ये भी सुना है कि बेसिक पे को ग्रॉस का कम से कम 50% रखने की बात है।
हाँ, ये उसी 50% वाले नियम का एक सीधा नतीजा या यूं कहें कि लागू करने का एक तरीका समझा जा रहा है। अगर आपकी एक्सक्लूडेड चीजें 50% से ज्यादा नहीं हो सकती, तो इसका मतलब यही निकलता है कि आपका बेसिक प्लस डीए प्लस रिटेनिंग अलाउंस जो मजदूरी है, कम से कम 50% होना चाहिए। बेसिक पे इसका सबसे बड़ा हिस्सा होता है आमतौर पर।
समझ गया। ये 50% वाला नियम तो बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है। क्या इस परिभाषा में और भी कुछ छोटी मोटी शर्तें हैं जिनका जिक्र जरूरी है? जी हाँ, 2 और चीजें हैं। एक दूसरा परंतुक है।
वो क्या कहता है?
वो ये कहता है कि जब बात समान काम के लिए समान वेतन या वेतन भुगतान की हो तो कुछ बाहर रखी गई चीजें जैसे कन्वेंस अलाउंस, एचआरए, अवार्ड सेटलमेंट और ओवरटाइम, इनको मजदूरी की गणना में शामिल किया जाएगा। ये एक खास मकसद के लिए है।
ओके, और दूसरी चीज?
दूसरी चीज एक स्पष्टीकरण है। वो कहता है कि अगर किसी कर्मचारी को उसके पूरी या कुछ सैलरी के बदले कोई चीज दी जाती है, मतलब कैश नहीं, कोई वस्तु,
रेम्यूनरेशन इन काइंड,
जैसे कंपनी कार दे दे या रहने को घर दे दे,
हाँ कुछ ऐसा,
तो उस वस्तु की कीमत अगर वो कुल वेतन के 15% से ज्यादा नहीं है तो उसे भी मजदूरी का हिस्सा माना जाएगा।
अच्छा, 15% तक की छूट है इसमें?
जी।
तो अगर हम पूरी बात को समेटें तो नई परिभाषा का लक्ष्य साफ है, कंफ्यूजन दूर करना, एक रूपता लाना। और वो जो 50% वाला नियम है वो ये पक्का करता है कि सैलरी का एक ठीक ठाक हिस्सा सोशल सिक्योरिटी लाभों जैसे पीएफ और ग्रेच्युटी की गणना के लिए इस्तेमाल हो।
बिल्कुल, मकसद यही है कि सैलरी स्ट्रक्चर ज्यादा पारदर्शी हो और कर्मचारियों के हितों की रक्षा हो, खासकर उनके भविष्य के लिए जो बचत होती है वो सही आधार पर हो।
ये तो हुई नियमों की बात। जाते जाते एक सवाल मन में आता है, परिभाषा तो ठीक है, स्पष्टता लाने की कोशिश है, पर असल में प्रैक्टिकली कंपनियां और कर्मचारी कैसे अपने सैलरी स्ट्रक्चर को एडजस्ट करेंगे? जैसे वो स्पेशल अलाउंस और बेसिक पे का बैलेंस कैसे बनाएंगे ताकि कानून की मंशा भी पूरी हो और ये 50% वाला नियम भी फॉलो हो? ये देखना दिलचस्प होगा।
हाँ, ये वाकई सोचने वाली बात है कि इसे जमीन पर कैसे उतारा जाएगा। इस पर आगे भी नजर रखनी होगी।
सत श्री अकाल। ਅੱਜ ਆਪਾਂ ਇੱਕ ਖਾਸ ਮੁੱਦੇ ਤੇ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ, ਭਾਰਤ ਦਾ ਨਵਾਂ ਕੋਡ ਔਨ ਵੇਜਸ 2019 ਤੇ ਖਾਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਇਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰੀ ਦੀ ਪਰਿਭਾਸ਼ਾ। ਅਸੀਂ ਕੁਝ ਕਾਨੂੰਨੀ ਦਸਤਾਵੇਜ਼ ਤੇ ਵਿਸ਼ਲੇਸ਼ਣ ਦੇਖੇ ਨੇ। ਮਕਸਦ ਬਸ ਇਹ ਸਮਝਣਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਨਵੇਂ ਕਾਨੂੰਨ ਮੁਤਾਬਿਕ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰੀ ਚ ਅਸਲ ਚ ਆਂਦਾ ਕੀ ਹੈ।
ਹਾਂਜੀ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ, ਇਹ ਬਹੁਤ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਹੈ। ਦੇਖੋ, ਇਹ ਕੋਡ ਲਿਆਂਦਾ ਤਾਂ ਇਸ ਲਈ ਗਿਆ ਸੀ ਕਿ 4 ਪੁਰਾਣੇ ਕਾਨੂੰਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਾ ਕੇ ਮਤਲਬ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਸੌਖੀਆਂ ਹੋ ਜਾਣ। ਪਰ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰੀ ਦੀ ਨਵੀਂ ਪਰਿਭਾਸ਼ਾ ਬਣਾਈ ਗਈ ਹੈ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੁਝ ਕੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਨੇ ਬਾਰੀਕੀਆਂ ਨੇ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਣਾ ਪਵੇਗਾ।
ਠੀਕ ਹੈ, ਤਾਂ ਉਹ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਤੋਂ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਬੁਨਿਆਦੀ ਗੱਲ, ਕਾਨੂੰਨ ਕੀ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਹੈ, ਕੀ ਸ਼ਾਮਿਲ ਹੈ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰੀ ਵਿੱਚ?
ਹਾਂਜੀ ਦੇਖੋ, ਕਾਨੂੰਨ 3 ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਸਾਫ਼-ਸਾਫ਼ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਹੈ। ਇੱਕ ਤਾਂ ਮੁੱਢਲੀ ਤਨਖਾਹ ਯਾਨੀ ਬੇਸਿਕ ਪੇ, ਦੂਜਾ ਮਹਿੰਗਾਈ ਭੱਤਾ ਡੀਅਰਨੈਸ ਅਲਾਉਂਸ ਤੇ ਤੀਜਾ ਜੇ ਕੋਈ ਰਿਟੇਨਿੰਗ ਅਲਾਉਂਸ ਮਿਲਦਾ ਹੈ ਤਾਂ ਉਹ ਵੀ। ਇਹ 3 ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਤਾਂ ਪੱਕਾ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰੀ ਦਾ ਹਿੱਸਾ ਨੇ।
ਓਕੇ, ਬੇਸਿਕ ਡੀਏ ਤੇ ਰਿਟੇਨਿੰਗ ਅਲਾਉਂਸ, ਇਹ ਤਾਂ ਸਿੱਧਾ ਲੱਗ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ, ਪਰ ਅਸਲ ਉਲਝਣ ਤਾਂ ਸ਼ਾਇਦ ਉੱਥੇ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਕੀ ਸ਼ਾਮਿਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ, ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਕੀ?
ਹਾਂ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਹੀ ਕਹਿ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ, ਉੱਥੇ ਹੀ ਅਸਲ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ। ਕਾਨੂੰਨ ਇੱਕ ਲੰਬੀ ਸੂਚੀ ਦਿੰਦਾ ਹੈ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਦੀ ਜੋ ਆਮ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰੀ ਚੋਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਨੇ, ਜਿਵੇਂ ਕਿ ਕੋਈ ਬੋਨਸ ਜੋ ਤਨਖਾਹ ਦਾ ਹਿੱਸਾ ਨਹੀਂ, ਘਰ ਦਾ ਕਿਰਾਇਆ ਭੱਤਾ ਯਾਨੀ ਐਚਆਰਏ, ਕੰਪਨੀ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਪੀਐਫ ਜਾਂ ਪੈਨਸ਼ਨ ਚ ਪਾਇਆ ਪੈਸਾ, ਆਉਣ ਜਾਣ ਦਾ ਭੱਤਾ ਜਾਂ ਕੋਈ ਖਾਸ ਖਰਚੇ ਪੂਰੇ ਕਰਨ ਲਈ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਰਕਮ। ਇਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਹੀ ਕਮਿਸ਼ਨ, ਓਵਰਟਾਈਮ ਦਾ ਪੈਸਾ, ਗ੍ਰੈਚੁਇਟੀ, ਨੌਕਰੀ ਤੋਂ ਕੱਢਣ ਵੇਲੇ ਦਾ ਮੁਆਵਜ਼ਾ, ਇਹ ਸਭ ਵੀ ਆਮ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਬਾਹਰ ਨੇ।
ਵਾਹ, ਇਹ ਤਾਂ ਕਾਫੀ ਲੰਬੀ ਸੂਚੀ ਹੈ। ਪਰ ਮੈਂ ਇੱਕ ਹੋਰ ਗੱਲ ਸੁਣੀ ਸੀ, ਕੋਈ ਖਾਸ ਸ਼ਰਤ, ਇੱਕ 50% ਵਾਲਾ ਨਿਯਮ, ਉਹ ਕੀ ਚੀਜ਼ ਹੈ?
ਬਿਲਕੁਲ, ਉਹੀ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਮਹੱਤਵਪੂਰਨ ਨੁਕਤਾ ਹੈ। ਇਹਨੂੰ ਪ੍ਰੋਵਾਈਜ਼ੋ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਨੇ, ਮਤਲਬ ਇੱਕ ਸ਼ਰਤ। ਇਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਰੱਖੀਆਂ ਗਈਆਂ ਨੇ, ਖਾਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਉਹ ਜੋ ਧਾਰਾ A ਤੋਂ I ਵਿੱਚ ਨੇ, ਜਿਵੇਂ ਬੋਨਸ, ਐਚਆਰਏ, ਸਫਰੀ ਪੱਤਾ, ਕਮਿਸ਼ਨ, ਓਵਰਟਾਈਮ ਵਗੈਰਾ, ਜੇ ਇਹ ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਮਿਲਾ ਕੇ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਕੁੱਲ ਤਨਖਾਹ ਯਾਨੀ ਰੈਮਿਊਨਰੇਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ 50% ਤੋਂ ਵੱਧ ਬਣ ਜਾਂਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ,
ਅੱਛਾ,
ਤਾਂ ਜਿੰਨੀ ਵੀ ਰਕਮ 50% ਤੋਂ ਉੱਪਰ ਹੋਵੇਗੀ ਉਹ ਵਾਪਸ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਗਿਣੀ ਜਾਵੇਗੀ।
ਓ, ਤਾਂ ਇੱਕ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦਾ ਚੈੱਕ ਹੈ ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਕੰਪਨੀਆਂ ਸਿਰਫ ਪੱਤੇ ਵਧਾ ਕੇ ਬੇਸਿਕ ਕੱਟ ਨਾ ਕਰ ਦੇਣ। ਇਹਦਾ ਮਤਲਬ ਤਾਂ ਇਹ ਹੋਇਆ ਕਿ ਬੇਸਿਕ ਪੇ, ਡੀਏ ਤੇ ਰਿਟੇਨਿੰਗ ਅਲਾਉਂਸ ਮਿਲਾ ਕੇ ਘੱਟੋ ਘੱਟ ਕੁੱਲ ਤਨਖਾਹ ਦਾ 50% ਹੋਣਾ ਹੀ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ।
ਇਹ ਸਭ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰੀ ਦੇ ਦਾਇਰੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਰਹੇ ਤੇ ਇਹਦਾ ਸਿੱਧਾ ਅਸਰ ਪੈਂਦਾ ਹੈ ਪ੍ਰੋਵੀਡੈਂਟ ਫੰਡ, ਪੀਐਫ ਤੇ ਗ੍ਰੈਚੁਇਟੀ ਵਰਗੇ ਲਾਭਾਂ ਤੇ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਉਹ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰੀ ਤੇ ਗਿਣੇ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਨੇ। ਤਾਂ ਹੁਣ ਯੋਗਦਾਨ ਵਧੇਗਾ। ਲੰਬੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਰਮਚਾਰੀ ਲਈ ਤਾਂ ਚੰਗਾ ਹੈ, ਪਰ ਹਾਂ, ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ ਸ਼ੁਰੂਆਤ ਵਿੱਚ ਮਹੀਨੇ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਟੇਕ ਹੋਮ ਤਨਖਾਹ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਥੋੜੀ ਜਿਹੀ ਘਟ ਲਾਵੇ।
ਸਮਝ ਗਿਆ। ਇਹ ਤਾਂ ਵੱਡੀ ਤਬਦੀਲੀ ਹੈ। ਪਰ ਕੁਝ ਖਾਸ ਭੱਤਿਆਂ ਬਾਰੇ, ਜਿਵੇਂ ਐਚਆਰਏ, ਕੀ ਉਹ ਹਮੇਸ਼ਾ ਬਾਹਰ ਹੀ ਰਹਿੰਦਾ ਜਾਂ ਕੋਈ ਹੋਰ ਗੱਲ ਵੀ ਹੈ?
HRA ਵੈਸੇ ਤਾਂ ਮੁੱਖ ਪਰਿਭਾਸ਼ਾ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਹੈ, ਪਰ ਇੱਥੇ ਇੱਕ ਹੋਰ ਦੂਜੀ ਸ਼ਰਤ ਵੀ ਹੈ। ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜਦੋਂ ਬਰਾਬਰ ਤਨਖਾਹ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਹੈ, ਮਤਲਬ ਮਾਰਦ ਔਰਤ ਟਰਾਂਸਜੈਂਡਰ ਸਭ ਨੂੰ ਬਰਾਬਰ ਕੰਮ ਲਈ ਬਰਾਬਰ ਪੈਸਾ, ਜਾਂ ਫਿਰ ਜਦੋਂ ਤਨਖਾਹ ਦੇਣ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਹੈ, ਪੇਮੈਂਟ ਆਫ ਵੇਜਸ, ਤਾਂ HRA ਧਾਰਾ F ਤੇ ਕੁਝ ਹੋਰ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਸਫਰੀ ਭੱਤਾ D, ਕੋਈ ਅਵਾਰਡ ਜਾਂ ਸਮਝੌਤੇ ਤਹਿਤ ਮਿਲਿਆ ਪੈਸਾ G ਤੇ ਓਵਰਟਾਈਮ H, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰੀ ਦੀ ਗਣਨਾ ਲਈ ਗਿਣਿਆ ਜਾਵੇਗਾ।
ਅੱਛਾ, ਤਾਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਖਾਸ ਮਕਸਦਾਂ ਲਈ HRA ਵਗੈਰਾ ਗਿਣਿਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਹੈ, ਠੀਕ। ਤੇ ਉਹ ਸਪੈਸ਼ਲ ਅਲਾਉਂਸ ਦਾ ਕੀ ਕਈ ਵਾਰ ਤਨਖਾਹ ਸਲਿੱਪ 'ਚ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੈ?
ਹਾਂ, ਸਪੈਸ਼ਲ ਅਲਾਉਂਸ ਵਾਲਾ ਮਾਮਲਾ ਥੋੜਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਕੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਨੇ ਗੁੰਝਲਦਾਰ ਹੈ। ਜੇਕਰ ਇਹ ਸਿਰਫ CTC ਨੂੰ ਪੂਰਾ ਕਰਨ ਲਈ ਇੱਕ ਬੈਲੈਂਸਿੰਗ ਰਕਮ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਉਹਦਾ ਕੋਈ ਖਾਸ ਮਕਸਦ ਨਹੀਂ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਗਿਆ, ਮਤਲਬ ਉਹ ਬਾਹਰ ਰੱਖੀਆਂ ਗਈਆਂ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਦੀ ਸੂਚੀ 'ਚ ਫਿੱਟ ਨਹੀਂ ਬੈਠਦਾ, ਤਾਂ ਅਦਾਲਤਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰੀ ਦਾ ਹਿੱਸਾ ਹੀ ਮੰਨਿਆ ਜਾਵੇਗਾ। ਇੱਕ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਭੇਸ ਬਦਲਿਆ ਪੱਤਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਚੱਲੇਗਾ।
ਠੀਕ ਹੈ, ਠੀਕ ਹੈ। ਹੁਣ ਬੋਨਸ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰੀਏ, ਕੀ ਕੋਈ ਘੱਟੋ ਘੱਟ ਬੋਨਸ ਦੀ ਗਾਰੰਟੀ ਹੈ ਇਸ ਕੋਡ 'ਚ?
ਹਾਂਜੀ, ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ। ਕਾਨੂੰਨ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਘੱਟੋ ਘੱਟ ਬੋਨਸ ਸਾਲ ਦੀ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰੀ ਦਾ 8.33% ਜਾਂ 100 ਰੁਪਏ ਜੋ ਵੀ ਵੱਧ ਹੋਵੇ ਦੇਣਾ ਲਾਜ਼ਮੀ ਹੈ, ਤੇ ਇਹ ਪੈਸਾ ਵਿੱਤੀ ਸਾਲ ਖਤਮ ਹੋਣ ਦੇ 8 ਮਹੀਨਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਅੰਦਰ ਅੰਦਰ ਦੇਣਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੈ, ਭਾਵੇਂ ਕੰਪਨੀ ਨੂੰ ਕੋਈ ਲਾਭ ਨਾ ਹੋਇਆ ਹੋਵੇ।
ਪਰ ਕੋਈ ਸ਼ਰਤਾਂ ਵੀ ਹੋਣਗੀਆਂ?
ਹਾਂ, ਇੱਕ ਸ਼ਰਤ ਹੈ। ਜੇ ਕੋਈ ਕਰਮਚਾਰੀ ਕਿਸੇ ਗਲਤ ਕੰਮ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਧੋਖਾਧੜੀ, ਹਿੰਸਕ ਵਿਵਹਾਰ, ਚੋਰੀ ਜਾਂ ਕੰਮ ਵਾਲੀ ਥਾਂ ਤੇ ਜਿਨਸੀ ਸ਼ੋਸ਼ਣ ਵਰਗੇ ਮਾਮਲੇ 'ਚ ਦੋਸ਼ੀ ਪਾਇਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਹੈ, ਤਾਂ ਉਸ ਨੂੰ ਬੋਨਸ ਤੋਂ ਵਾਂਝਾ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਾ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ।
ਓਕੇ, ਤੇ ਆਖਰੀ ਸਵਾਲ ਬਰਾਬਰ ਤਨਖਾਹ ਬਾਰੇ। ਕੋਡ ਇਹ ਯਕੀਨੀ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਬਣਾਉਂਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਲਿੰਗ ਦੇ ਆਧਾਰ ਤੇ ਵਿਤਕਰਾ ਨਾ ਹੋਵੇ?
ਕੋਡ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਪਸ਼ਟ ਹੈ ਇਸ ਮਾਮਲੇ 'ਚ। ਇਹ ਸਾਫ਼ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇੱਕੋ ਜਿਹਾ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਨ ਲਈ ਜਾਂ ਮਿਲਦੇ-ਜੁਲਦੇ ਕੰਮ ਲਈ ਲਿੰਗ ਦੇ ਆਧਾਰ ਤੇ ਤਨਖਾਹ 'ਚ ਕੋਈ ਫਰਕ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਾ ਸਕਦਾ। ਮਰਦ, ਔਰਤ, ਟਰਾਂਸਜੈਂਡਰ ਸਭ ਲਈ ਬਰਾਬਰ ਤਨਖਾਹ। ਤੇ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਮੈਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਸੀ, ਬਰਾਬਰ ਤਨਖਾਹ ਨੂੰ ਯਕੀਨੀ ਬਣਾਉਣ ਵੇਲੇ ਕੁਝ ਪੱਤੇ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਸਫਰੀ ਭੱਤਾ, HRA, ਅਵਾਰਡ ਪੇਮੈਂਟ ਤੇ ਓਵਰਟਾਈਮ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਗਿਣਿਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਹੈ ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਸਹੀ ਤੁਲਨਾ ਹੋ ਸਕੇ।
ਤਾਂ ਜੇ ਸਾਰੀ ਗੱਲ ਦਾ ਨਿਚੋੜ ਕੱਢੀਏ, ਇਹ ਨਵੀਂ ਪਰਿਭਾਸ਼ਾ ਇੱਕ ਸਟੈਂਡਰਡ ਲਿਆਉਣ ਦੀ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਹੈ, ਪਰ ਉਹ 50% ਵਾਲੀ ਸ਼ਰਤ ਤੇ ਕੁਝ ਪੱਤਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਖਾਸ ਨਿਯਮ, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਕਰਕੇ ਥੋੜੀ ਗੁੰਝਲਦਾਰ ਵੀ ਹੈ। ਤੇ ਇਹ ਤਨਖਾਹ ਦੇ ਢਾਂਚੇ, ਮਤਲਬ ਸੈਲਰੀ ਸਟਰਕਚਰ ਤੇ PF ਗ੍ਰੈਚੁਇਟੀ ਵਰਗੇ ਲਾਭਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕਾਫੀ ਪ੍ਰਭਾਵਿਤ ਕਰ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ।
ਬਿਲਕੁਲ, ਮਕਸਦ ਤਾਂ ਇਹੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਸਪਸ਼ਟਤਾ ਆਵੇ, ਸਮਾਜਿਕ ਸੁਰੱਖਿਆ ਵਾਲੇ ਯੋਗਦਾਨ ਵਧਣ ਤੇ ਨਾਲ ਹੀ ਕੰਪਨੀਆਂ ਲਈ ਵੀ ਕਾਨੂੰਨ ਦੀ ਪਾਲਣਾ ਸੌਖੀ ਹੋਵੇ। ਇੱਕ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦਾ ਸੰਤੁਲਨ ਬਣਾਉਣ ਦੀ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਹੈ ਇਹ।
ਬਹੁਤ ਵਧੀਆ। ਅਖੀਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਸੁਣਨ ਵਾਲਿਆਂ ਲਈ ਇੱਕ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਛੱਡ ਕੇ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਫਰਕ ਹੈ ਮਜ਼ਦੂਰੀ ਜੋ ਕਾਨੂੰਨੀ ਲਾਭਾਂ ਲਈ ਵਰਤੀ ਜਾਂਦੀ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਕੁੱਲ ਮਿਹਨਤਾਨਾ ਯਾਨੀ ਪੂਰਾ ਪੈਕੇਜ ਵਿੱਚ, ਇਹ ਭਵਿੱਖ ਵਿੱਚ ਤਨਖਾਹ ਬਾਰੇ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਜਾਂ ਕੰਪਨੀਆਂ ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਮੁਆਵਜ਼ੇ ਦੇ ਪੈਕੇਜ ਬਣਾਉਂਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ ਉਸ ਨੂੰ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਬਦਲ ਸਕਦਾ है, इस बारे सोचा जा सकता है।
आज हम हिंदुस्तान के नए लेबर कोड्स में एक बहुत अहम बुनियादी तब्दीली पर बात कर रहे हैं। ये है उजरत यानी वेजेस की नई तारीफ।
जी बिल्कुल।
पहले कई कानून थे, हर एक में उजरत का मतलब थोड़ा यूं समझे अलग सा था, काफी उलझन थी।
हाँ बिल्कुल। अब ये जो कोड ऑन वेजेस 2019 है, इसने कोशिश की है कि एक ही वाज़े तारीफ हो सबके लिए।
तो चलें जरा इसको खोलते हैं, समझते हैं कि आखिर ये है क्या।
यकीनन, और ये समझना बहुत जरूरी है क्योंकि इसी तारीफ की बुनियाद पर आप देखें कम से कम उजरत, PF, ग्रेजुएटी, बोनस, इन सब चीजों का हिसाब किताब होता है।
अच्छा, तो ये नई तारीफ आसान लफ्जों में कहती क्या है?
देखिए, बुनियादी तौर पर यह कहती है कि उजरत हर वो मुआवजा है जो पैसों में दिया जा सके और जो मुलाजमत की शराइत के तहत काबिल अदायगी हो,
चाहे वो तनख्वाह हो, अलाउंस हो या कुछ और।
जी हाँ, और कोड ने बहुत वाजे कर दिया है कि 3 चीजें तो इसमें लाजमन शामिल हैं।
कौन सी 3 चीजें?
पहली, बुनियादी तनख्वाह यानी बेसिक पे। दूसरी, महंगाई अलाउंस जिसे DNS अलाउंस या DA कहते हैं
जी।
और तीसरी, रिटेनिंग अलाउंस अगर किसी को मिलता हो। ये 3 तो उजरत की बुनियाद हैं।
ठीक है, ये तो हो गई वो चीजें जो उजरत है, लेकिन तनख्वाह की स्लिप देखें तो उसमें और भी बहुत कुछ होता है। तो क्या चीजें हैं जो इस तारीफ से बाहर रखी गई हैं?
हाँ, ये अहम सवाल है। कोर्ट ने एक फहरिस्त दी है इन चीजों की जो आमतौर पर उजरत नहीं समझी जाएंगी।
अच्छा, मसलन?
जैसे वो बोनस जो मुलाजमत की शराइत का लाजमी हिस्सा ना हो, या घर के किराए का अलाउंस यानी HRA।
ओ, HRA भी बाहर है?
जी, इसी तरह कंपनी की तरफ से दी गई रिहाइश या बिजली पानी वगैरह की सहूलत की कीमत, अजर का पीएफ या पेंशन फंड में हिस्सा,
सफर खर्च, कन्वेंस अलाउंस,
वो भी बाहर है। और मुलाजमत के दौरान कोई खास खर्चा हो जाए तो उसकी अदायगी, ओवर टाइम अलाउंस, कमीशन, ग्रेजुइटी, रिटायरमेंट पर मिलने वाले दूसरे फायदे, ये सब इस बुनियादी तारीफ से बाहर हैं।
अरे अगर एचआरए, कन्वीनियंस अलाउंस ये सब बाहर है तो इससे तो वो रकम जिस पर पीएफ या ग्रेचुइटी कटती है वो तो काफी कम हो सकती है।
बिल्कुल, आपने सही नुक्ता पकड़ा। और इसी मसले से निपटने के लिए कोड में एक बहुत अहम शर्त डाली गई है।
अच्छा, वो क्या है?
इसे यूं समझें कि ये 50% का उसूल है।
50% का उसूल?
जी, कानून कहता है कि अगर ये तमाम खारिज शुदा चीजें यानी एचआरए, कन्वीनियंस, एलटीए, बोनस वगैरह जो फहरिस्त ए से आई तक हैं, ये सब मिलाकर
जी जी,
कुल मिलने वाले मुआवजे के 50% से ज्यादा हो जाएं,
अच्छा,
तो जितनी रकम 50% से ऊपर जाएगी उस इजाफी रकम को वापस उजरत में शामिल कर लिया जाएगा।
अच्छा, यानी आजर तनख्वाह का ढांचा ऐसा नहीं बना सकते कि बुनियादी तनख्वाह बहुत कम और अलाउंसेस बहुत ज्यादा हों सिर्फ पीएफ या ग्रेचुइटी बचाने के लिए।
बिल्कुल सही। अगर अलाउंसेस कुल मुआवजे के आधे से ज्यादा हुए तो जो हिस्सा आधे से ज्यादा है वो खुद ब खुद उजरत का हिस्सा बन जाएगा।
ये तो वाकई एक बड़ी तब्दीली है। इससे तो कम से कम आधी तनख्वाह पर कानूनी वाजबात का हिसाब लगेगा।
यकीनन, मकसद यही है कि मुलाजमीन के कानूनी हुकूक का तहफ्फुज हो। लेकिन एक और शर्त भी है।
एक और? अच्छा, वो किस बारे में है?
जी, वो दूसरी शर्त खास तौर पर 2 मकासद के लिए है। पहला, तमाम जिन्सों के लिए बराबर उजरत को यकीनी बनाना।
ठीक है।
और दूसरा, उजरत की बरवक्त अदायगी को यकीनी बनाना। तो सिर्फ इन 2 मकासद के लिए जब हिसाब लगाया जाएगा
जी,
तो कुछ मखसूस खारिजशुदा अलाउंसेस जैसे कन्वीनियंस अलाउंस, एचआरए, किसी अदालती फैसले या अवार्ड के तहत मिलने वाली रकम और ओवर टाइम अलाउंस, इनको उजरत में शामिल माना जाएगा।
ओह, तो ये सिर्फ उन 2 खास सूरतों के लिए है, यानी बराबर उजरत और वक्त पर अदायगी के लिए?
जी हाँ, ये प्रोवाइजो सिर्फ उन 2 मकासद के लिए है।
ठीक है, तो इन सब तब्दीलियों का, खास तौर पर वो 50% वाले उसूल का, आम मुलाजिम की जेब पर क्या असर पड़ेगा? क्या हाथ में आने वाली तनख्वाह, टेक होम सैलरी बदलेगी?
हाँ, ये एक अहम नुक्ता है। चूंकि अब ये यकीनी बनाना होगा कि कम से कम 50% मुआवजा उजरत के जुमरे में आए जिसमें बुनियादी तनख्वाह शामिल है।
जी,
तो हो सकता है कि बुनियादी तनख्वाह बढ़े, और जब बुनियादी तनख्वाह बढ़ेगी तो उस पर कटने वाला पीएफ और ग्रेजुइटी का हिस्सा भी बढ़ेगा।
तो मतलब महीने के आखिर में हाथ में कम पैसे आएंगे?
फौरी तौर पर जी हाँ, कुछ मुलाजमीन के लिए ऐसा हो सकता है कि टेक होम सैलरी थोड़ी कम हो जाए, क्योंकि ज्यादा रकम समाजी तहफ्फुज यानी पीएफ और ग्रेजुइटी फंड्स में जारी होगी।
लेकिन लंबे अरसे में फायदा होगा?
बिल्कुल, लंबे अरसे में रिटायरमेंट पर या मुलाजमत छोड़ते वक्त मिलने वाले फवाइद ज्यादा होंगे। एक और छोटी सी बात है, मुआवजा बसूरत अशिया की।
वो क्या है?
यानी अगर किसी मुलाजिम को तनख्वाह के कुछ हिस्से के बदले नकद पैसे नहीं बल्कि कोई चीज दी जाती है तो उस चीज की कीमत भी उजरत का हिस्सा समझी जाएगी, लेकिन उसकी हद कुल उजरत के 15% तक है।
अच्छा, तो खुलासा ये हुआ कि उजरत की ये जो नई एक तारीफ लाने की कोशिश की गई है वो बज़ाहिर तो मयारी है
जी,
लेकिन इसमें क्या शामिल है क्या नहीं, और फिर वो 50% वाला उसूल और वो दूसरी शर्त, ये मिलकर इसे काफी मतलब पेचीदा बना देते हैं।
बिल्कुल, और ये बराए रास्त पीएफ, ग्रेजुइटी जैसी अहम चीजों के हिसाब किताब पर असरअंदाज होती है।
तो क्या इससे वाकई उलझन कम होगी?
यही तो असल सवाल है जिस पर गौर करना चाहिए। मकसद तो वजाहत लाना और कारकुनों का तहफ्फुज था, लेकिन क्या ये नई तारीफ, खास तौर पर ये 50% वाला उसूल, अमली तौर पर नाफिज करना आसान होगा?
खास तौर पर छोटे कारोबारों के लिए शायद।
हाँ, मुमकिन है। आजरों और मुलाजमों दोनों को अब अपनी तनख्वाह की साख्त को इस नई तारीफ की रोशनी में दोबारा देखना और समझना पड़ेगा। असल इम्तिहान तो इसके निफाज का है। क्या ये वाकई उलझन कम करेगा या मजीद सवालात खड़े करेगा? ये आप कह लें वक्त ही बताएगा।
Welcome to the deep dive. Ever looked at your payslip and felt like you needed a legal decoder ring?
Happens all the time.
Right. Today, we're diving into something that affects pretty much everyone who works. Wages. Now you might think, yeah, I know what wages are, but under employment law, especially with India's new code on wages, Well, that definition gets a really interesting, maybe even surprising twist. So our mission today is to unpack what the law actually means by wages and, crucially, why it really matters to your finances.
It really does. It's much more than just the number you see hitting your bank account each month. Understanding let's say, the legal nuts and bolts here can really shed light on how your whole compensation package is put together.
And how it affects things down the line.
Exactly. Everything from, your long-term savings like Provident Fund to Social Security benefits. It often works in ways you might not immediately expect.
Okay, let's definitely unpack this then. The Code on Wages, 2019, it sounds like a big deal. It basically takes a bunch of older, separate laws.
Yeah, like the Payment of Wages Act, Minimum Wages Act.
Right, those ones. And it brings them together, aiming for one clear definition of wages. So, okay, bottom line. What does this new definition actually say wages are?
Well, at its core, wages covers all remuneration things, salary, allowances, anything really that's expressed in money or even can be expressed in money.
Right.
And it's what's payable to you for the job you do, assuming, of course, you've met the terms of your employment. It's like the financial foundation of your job contract.
Got it. The foundation. So what parts are always included in that foundation? The non-negotiables.
The code is very specific here. It explicitly includes three main things. Your basic pay, dearness allowance, that's the bit meant to counter inflation, and any retaining allowance. That last one is sometimes paid just to keep you on the books, maybe during off seasons. Those three are always fundamental.
Okay, basic, DA, retaining allowance. Clear. But here's where I think it gets really interesting for a lot of us. Our pay slips often have loads of other lines. What common things are specifically not included in this legal definition?
Yes, this is absolutely crucial. And honestly, the list is pretty long.
Okay.
The definition specifically excludes many common items, things like your house rent allowance, HRA,
Right.
any bonus, unless it's actually written into your employment terms as guaranteed remuneration, also out. Overtime pay, commissions, even your employer's contributions to your pension or provident fund.
Wow. Okay.
And there's more the value of things like company housing or utilities provided, medical benefits sometimes, travel concessions, gratuity paid when you leave, all generally excluded.
And that feels like a lot to exclude. It makes you wonder, couldn't an employer just, structure pay so almost everything falls into these excluded buckets to lower their liabilities?
Yeah.
Like for PF contributions?
That's the exact concern, and the code anticipated this. There's a very important proviso, a condition, basically built in to prevent exactly that kind of maneuvering.
Okay, how does that work?
It says that if the total sum of certain excluded payments, specifically things like bonuses, HRA, conveyance allowance, commissions, these kinds of variable or non-core parts, if that total adds up to more than 50%, so half of your overall total remuneration.
More than half.
Yes, if it exceeds 50%, then the amount over that 50% mark is legally deemed to be the wages. It gets added back into the wage calculation for things like statutory benefits.
Okay. So the law puts a cap on how much can be shifted out. It's saying essentially at least half your total pay must count as the wage foundation for calculating benefits.
Precisely. It forces a significant chunk of your pay to be counted as wages.
That's a massive change. So while maybe your immediate take-home pay might see a small adjustment in some cases,
Possibly, yeah.
your long-term security, things like your Provident Fund pot and maybe your gratuity amount, could actually end up being noticeably bigger.
That's the intended effect, a boost to long-term savings and Social Security. But wait, there's another interesting layer here.
Oh.
Yes, some of those things we said are generally excluded, like conveyance allowance, HRA, remuneration from awards, overtime, even though they're out of the main definition for, say, PF calculation. They are specifically brought back in for certain other purposes.
Like what?
Crucially, for ensuring equal pay for equal work between all genders, and also for the general calculation of wage payments themselves.
So they're excluded for some things, but included for others.
Exactly. It shows the code is trying to perform this careful balancing act, using components strategically to hit different goals, fair benefits, and social justice, like gender pay equity. Oh, and one other quick point. If you get paid partly in kind, like maybe housing or food, the value of that can only count towards your wages up to 15% of your total wages. Anything more than that 15% in kind doesn't count as wages.
Fascinating. So it's clear the word wages isn't just simple everyday language in this context.
Not at all.
It's a really precise legal term designed to bring clarity, protect minimum earnings, push for gender equality, and ultimately secure better long-term benefits for millions of us working across India.
Absolutely. Connecting it to the bigger picture, it's really about streamlining those complex old labor laws and creating a stronger, more uniform Social Security net for you, the employee.
Well, our deep dive today definitely shows that getting your head around these definitions is really the essential first step to understanding your rights and what you're truly entitled to.
It really is, and maybe something for you to think about. As companies start adjusting their salary structures to fit this new, very specific definition of wages, what kind of other changes or maybe even innovations might we see popping up in compensation packages in the future? How could this reshape how we think about pay?
Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Think about how often we use words like wages or salary.
All the time.
Exactly, they're just part of our everyday vocabulary.
Yeah.
But stop for a moment. How many of us truly understand what legally constitutes these terms?
Probably not many.
It's far more complex than just the money that, lands in your bank account at the end of the month.
Yeah.
It touches every aspect of your financial life.
Absolutely. From how much is deducted for your future to what benefits you're truly entitled to.
Yeah, the stuff that really matters long term.
That's absolutely right. What you see on your payslip, your take-home pay, is actually built upon a foundational legal definition.
Okay.
And that definition dictates everything from your immediate earnings to your long-term Social Security benefits, like your Provident Fund or gratuity.
Right, the big ones.
And historically, especially in a country like India, these definitions have been, anything but simple or straightforward. They were often quite fragmented.
Which is precisely why today our mission is to unpack one of the most intricately woven and critically important legal definitions in recent memory.
We're talking about the definition of wages as laid out in India's landmark Code on Wages 2019.
Exactly. We're going to go beyond just defining it. We want to reveal its far-reaching implications for both employees, like you, trying to understand your compensation, and for employers navigating this new era of compliance. It's a big shift for everyone involved.
Definitely. And to guide us through this significant legal reform, we've pulled together a really comprehensive stack of sources.
Good stuff. What do we got?
Well, we've got direct legal excerpts from the code itself, which is crucial. We also have detailed briefing documents from various legal and financial institutions, plus expert analyses that highlight the practical, the real-world implications.
It's a good mix.
Yeah, together they paint a pretty complete and nuanced picture. Hopefully we can make sure you're well-informed, quickly and thoroughly.
All right, let's unpack this. Our deep dive begins by understanding the monumental shift that India's Code on Wages 2019 truly represents within the country's vast and, let's be honest, often bewildering labor law landscape.
Oh, absolutely. Bewildering is a good word for it sometimes.
This wasn't just a minor update or a small tweak, was it? This was foundational, a seismic event in Indian industrial relations.
It truly was. The Code on Wages 2019 was widely heralded as a historic step, and the goal was simplifying what had become an incredibly complex, fragmented, and frankly cumbersome labor landscape in India.
Right, years and years of laws piling up.
Exactly. For decades, the country operated under this bewildering array of laws. It often led to a system that, confused more than it clarified.
Our sources really underscore the scale of this ambition. The Indian government undertook this massive exercise.
That is right.
Aiming to consolidate a staggering 29 existing, often overlapping, sometimes even contradictory central labor laws.
29 down to just 4 codes. It's a huge simplification effort.
And the Code on Wages was the very first of these 4 to actually be enacted, right? It just kind of set the stage.
Precisely. It really set the tone and paved the way for the others. And it specifically replaced 4 crucial pieces of pre-existing legislation.
Okay, which ones were those?
The Payment of Wages Act of 1936, the Minimum Wages Act of 1948.
Okay, familiar names.
The Payment of Bonus Act of 1965, and the Equal Remuneration Act of 1976.
So, core pieces of labor law.
Absolutely. And the primary aims were crystal clear. Streamline the whole legal framework, ensure timely wage payments for everyone, and perhaps the most ambitious part, universalize minimum wages across every sector and region.
Universalize, that's a big word. And when we talk about that, the scale of intended beneficiaries is truly staggering, isn't it?
It really is. We're talking about an estimated 500 million workers.
500 million, wow.
Yeah. now covered by minimum wage and timely payment protections. And crucially, regardless of their sector, whether they're in organized industries or the vast unorganized sector, and regardless of their previous wage ceilings.
So it brings millions more under that basic protection umbrella.
It's an unprecedented expansion of basic worker rights in India.
And beyond the direct benefits to workers, there were broader goals tied into this, weren't there? Like economic ambitions.
Yes, definitely. The broader stated goals were deeply intertwined with India's economic ambitions. The government explicitly intended these changes to promote initiatives like Make in India.
How so?
By creating a more predictable and less burdensome regulatory environment. The idea was also to significantly enhance the ease of doing business within the country.
Ah, okay. To attract more investment, boost growth.
Exactly. Hoping to attract more domestic and foreign investment and boost overall economic growth. That was a key driver.
Okay. To really grasp the significance of this overhaul, maybe we should rewind a little, look at the historical context. Because India's history of wage regulation is, well, long and messy.
Fascinatingly messy, yes. India actually has a long and storied history of labor laws with significant milestones. But things really began to multiply after the Industrial Disputes Act of 1947.
That was a key one.
Yes, the 1947 Act was foundational, but what followed was this dramatic proliferation of laws.
Right.
We saw an additional 45 national laws, plus another 200 state laws, all adding layers upon layers of complexity.
Wow, 45 national, 200 state. No wonder it was confusing.
It really evolved into an administrative labyrinth, almost by accident, it seems.
An administrative nightmare is hardly an understatement. Our sources paint a vivid picture of the absurdity this fragmentation led to.
Like what?
For example, some companies apparently had to keep 6 different attendance logs for different regulations.
6 logs, just for attendance.
Yeah, and maintain 10 different accounts just for overtime wages. File 5 different types of annual returns, all dictated by different statutes.
That's incredibly complex.
And it wasn't just about accounting. The regulations apparently delved into incredibly granular operational details. Things like specifying the exact height of urinals in workers' washrooms.
You're kidding.
No. Or mandating how often a workspace had to be whitewashed. It sounds almost comical, but it was a very real burden for businesses.
That level of detail and fragmentation certainly underscored the urgent need for consolidation and simplification. It just wasn't efficient.
Definitely not.
And beyond these operational challenges, we also saw key evolutionary milestones in the sort of philosophical approach to wage regulation.
Like the idea of a minimum wage floor.
Exactly. For instance, the concept of a national floor-level minimum wage, or NFLMW, was first introduced back in 1996.
Okay.
Though initially it was merely advisory, a voluntary benchmark, not legally binding everywhere.
And court rulings also played a pivotal role in shaping this wage philosophy, didn't they?
Oh, hugely. Take the Supreme Court's landmark 1992 ruling in the case of Reptaco's Brett & Co. v. Labor.
What did that case establish?
Well, this judgment significantly broadened the factors considered for minimum wage determination. It pushed beyond just basic, caloric needs or bare survival.
To include what?
It pushed towards a more holistic view of a living wage, factoring in things like children's education, essential medical needs, provisions for entertainment, and even old age provisions.
That's a powerful expansion of what minimum wage should actually cover. More than just subsistence.
Absolutely. A real shift in thinking. Then, more recently, India's commitment to international labor standards was reinforced by its ratification of ILO Convention 81 in 2019.
The ILO being the International Labor Organization.
Correct. And this particular convention, C81, emphasizes the right of labor inspectors to enter premises without prior notice to ensure compliance.
Strengthening enforcement.
Exactly. It signaled a clear intent for more robust enforcement, even as the laws themselves were undergoing this massive reform process.
Okay, so all of this historical context, this winding journey through decades of complex labor legislation, brings us right to the core of our deep dive today. Deconstructing the new, simplified, and supposedly uniform definition of wages under the Code on Wages 2019. This is really where the rubber meets the road, isn't it?
It really is, and it's fascinating because this single uniform definition is arguably the most significant change introduced by the code.
Why so significant?
Well, historically, Indian labor law suffered from what our sources aptly describe as complicated definitions.
Right. Different laws, different definitions.
Exactly. What one act considered wages, another might not. Think about the Employees Provident Funds Act, the EPF Act.
For retirement savings.
Right. And the Employees State Insurance Act? the ESI Act for medical and other benefits. Each had their own distinct, often conflicting definitions of what counted as wages.
And that, predictably, must have led to several issues relating to applicability and interpretation, as our sources say.
Absolutely. Widespread confusion, uncertainty, both for employers trying desperately to comply with this patchwork of laws.
And employees just trying to figure out what they were actually owed.
Precisely. So the new code aims to sweep all that ambiguity away with one clear, concise, and crucially uniform definition.
Okay, let's get into it. Let's lay out that foundational definition directly from the code. But yeah, break it down for us piece by piece.
Will do. So the code states that wages means all remuneration. Okay, first key bit. Whether by way of salaries, allowances, or otherwise.
Okay, so all remuneration, salaries, allowances, pretty broad.
Very broad. Then, expressed in terms of money or capable of being so expressed.
Meaning it has to have a monetary value, even if it's not straight cash.
Right. And it continues, which would, if the terms of employment, express or implied, were fulfilled, be payable to a person employed in respect of his employment or of work done in such employment.
Okay, so basically everything you get paid for your job, that can be valued in money and that you're entitled to under your employment contract. That's the starting point.
That's the broad umbrella, exactly. And then the code gets more specific. It goes on to explicitly list what is always included, things that are unequivocally part of your core wage.
Right, the non-negotiables.
Precisely. The code says it includes 1, basic pay, 2, dearness allowance, and 3, retaining allowance, if any.
So those three are the bedrock. Basic pay, that's obvious, the fundamental component.
Yep.
Dearness allowance, or DA, you mentioned that, is to offset inflation, cost of living changes.
Correct. Protecting your purchasing power.
And retaining allowance.
Yeah.
What exactly is that again? Our sources said it's specific.
Yeah, it's not just a general special allowance. It's a distinct component. It usually needs to be specifically provided for and detailed in your appointment letter.
Okay.
It typically signifies a payment to ensure an employee, well, sticks around, remains with the company. Often during periods of no work or reduced work, like you might see in seasonal industries.
Got it. So basic, DA, and retaining allowance, if applicable, are always in.
Always in.
What's particularly insightful here, and our sources pointed this out, is how the code's specific inclusions directly counter some past practices.
How so?
Well, historically, employers had considerable discretion in structuring compensation packages, right?
A lot of leeway.
And they would often minimize their statutory liabilities, things like gratuity or provident fund contributions, by keeping the basic wage component artificially low.
Ah, yes. The classic strategy. Inflate the allowances instead.
Exactly. Inflate other allowances that weren't subject to those calculations. It reduced their overall cost of employment, but often, at the expense of the employee's long-term benefits.
Right. So the code aims to stop that by clearly defining these core inclusions.
Okay, so that's what's in. Now let's clip it. What's not part of wages? The explicit exclusions. This seems just as important for clarity.
Absolutely crucial. The code provides a pretty comprehensive list, 11 specific components that are not included in the definition of wages. This sets clear boundaries, prevents ambiguity.
Okay, let's go through some of the key ones. What's definitely out?
Right, so the code clearly states that wages does not include, and then lists them. First, A, any bonus payable under any law, which does not form part of the remuneration payable under the terms of employment.
So like a statutory bonus that's separate from your regular agreed salary.
Exactly. Then B, the value of any house accommodation or of the supply of light, water, medical attendance, or other amenity excluded by government order.
So things like company housing, utilities, maybe some medical facilities provided directly by the employer if the government says they're excluded.
Correct. Also excluded is C, any contribution paid by the employer to any pension or provident fund and the interest which may have accrued thereon.
Okay, that makes sense. The employer's contribution to your PF or pension isn't part of your immediate wage. It's a separate benefit.
Precisely. It's going towards your future savings.
What else is on the exclusion list? It seemed quite long.
It is quite comprehensive. It continues with D, any conveyance allowance or the value of any traveling concession.
Like your travel allowance to get to work.
Yes. Then E, any sum paid to defray special expenses entailed on him by the nature of his employment.
So reimbursements for specific job-related costs.
Right. And then a really significant one, F, house rent allowance or HRA.
HRA explicitly excluded. We'll come back to why that's so important.
Definitely. Also excluded. G, remuneration payable under any award or settlement. or order of a court or tribunal.
Like a legal settlement amount.
Yes. And any overtime allowance.
Overtime pay is out of the basic wage definition.
Correct. Then, any commission payable to the employee, any gratuity payable on the termination of employment, and finally, any retrenchment compensation or other retirement benefit, or any ex gratia payment made on the termination of employment.
Okay, wow. That is a very detailed list. HRA, overtime, commission, gratuity, severance pay, all specifically carved out of the main wages definition. Now, you mentioned HRA. House rent allowance being a particularly significant exclusion. Why is that? What does it change from before?
That's a really crucial point, and our sources emphasize it. Previously, HRA was often included by employers as part of the minimum wage calculation.
Really? How did that work?
Well, it was quite common practice, and its primary purpose was often, let's be frank, to minimize their Provident Fund or PF burden.
Because PF was calculated on basic wage, not HRA.
Exactly. And there were even court cases like G4S Security Services versus APFC that had upheld this approach. They allowed employers to count HRA towards minimum wage, which, by extension, reduced their PF contributions because the basic wage portion could be kept lower.
So employers could strategically structure salaries, put a large chunk under the HRA label instead of basic pay, and save on their statutory contributions.
That was the loophole, essentially. But the new code targets this directly
Oh.
by explicitly excluding HRA from the definition of wages used for these statutory calculations. The Code on Wages makes it clear employers can no longer split wages under the head of HRA and count it as part of minimum wage for things like PF.
So it forces a higher basic wage component.
Yes. This explicit exclusion creates, as one source put it, an extra burden on the part of the employers for Provident Fund, because HRA can no longer be used to artificially deflate that wage base. It forces a higher foundational wage for these critical benefits.
Okay, so we have the core definition, the inclusions, the exclusions. But there's this crucial twist, isn't there? This real game changer that prevents employers from just, gaming the system with allowances.
Yes. You're talking about the 50% rule.
Exactly, or what the code calls the quantitative benchmark. This seems absolutely fundamental to understanding the impact.
It is, without a doubt, the crucial proviso. It effectively prevents potential circumvention of the new wage definition. It's designed to ensure the spirit of the law is upheld, not just the letter.
Okay, so what does the code actually say? Let's get the legal wording again and then break it down.
Right, the code states, provided that, for calculating the wages under this clause, if payments made by the employer to the employee under clauses A to I.
Okay, so that's referring to those excluding components we just listed: bonus, amenities value, conveyance, HRA, overtime, commission, etc. Exclusions A through I.
Correct. If payments under clauses A to I exceeds 1/2 or such other percent as may be notified by the central government of the all remuneration calculated under this clause.
So if those excluded payments make up more than 50% of the total remuneration.
Exactly. The amount which exceeds such 1/2 or the percent so notified shall be deemed as remuneration and shall be accordingly added in wages under this clause.
Okay, that's dense legal language. Let's translate that. What does it mean practically for you, the listener?
In plain English, look at your total pay package, everything the employer gives you. Now look at all those things listed as exclusions, HRA, conveyance allowance, overtime, commission, certain bonuses, etc., specifically items A to I.
Yeah.
If all those excluded things added together make up more than 50% of your total remuneration,
Then what happens?
then the excess amount, the part that's above the 50% mark, gets added back into the definition of wages for calculating things like Provident Fund and potentially gratuity.
So employers can't just load up, say, 70% of your pay into excluded allowances to keep the wage base super low.
Precisely. To put it simply, imagine your total salary as a pie. Before, an employer could slice it so only a tiny sliver was basic pay, and the rest was allowances, many excluded from PF calculations.
Minimizing their contributions.
Right. Now, the 50% rule essentially says, no matter how you slice your employee's pie, at least half of it must be considered their core wage for statutory benefits.
And if the non-wage slices, exclusions to Y, add up to more than 50%.
That excess part automatically gets pulled back into the wage calculation. It's a powerful mechanism.
Like, that is a game changer. It fundamentally alters cost structures for employers and significantly enhances the wage base for employee benefits. It forces a minimum wage component of 50%.
It ensures, as one analysis put it, at least half of an employee's gross remuneration remains within the scope of statutory benefit calculations.
That truly reshapes how companies have to structure compensation. And there's a further proviso too, isn't there? Something about equal pay.
Yes, another important layer. The code adds, provided further that for the purpose of equal wages to all genders and for the purpose of payment of wages, the emoluments specified in clauses D, F, G, and H shall be taken for computation of wage.
Okay, what does that mean? Which clauses are D, F, G, and H again?
Those are D, conveyance allowance, F, house rent allowance, G, remuneration under award settlements, and H, overtime allowance.
So things that are normally excluded from the main wage definition.
Exactly. This second proviso is a critical safeguard specifically for pay parity. It says that even though these components are generally excluded for, say, PF calculations, they must be considered when determining if a company is paying men and women equally for the same work.
I see. So you can't pay a man a higher HRA or conveyance allowance than a woman doing the same job and claim their wages are equal because HRA and conveyance are excluded from the main definition.
Precisely. It closes a potential loophole that could have been used for discriminatory pay practices based on allowances. For equal pay calculations, those specific allowances are counted back in.
That's a really smart inclusion. And one final detail in the definition, something about remuneration in kind, non-cash benefits.
Yes, there's an explanation for that. It says, explanation, where an employee is given in lieu of the whole or part of the wages payable to him, any remuneration in kind by his employer.
Like company housing or maybe food coupons.
Could be. The value of such remuneration in kind, which does not exceed 15% of the total wages payable to him, shall be deemed to form part of the wages of such employee.
So if an employer provides benefits in kind, their value can be considered part of wages, but only up to a limit.
A strict limit, only up to 15% of the total wages. This keeps a check on how much of the wage can be paid in non-cash forms.
Right. It prevents an employer from, say, giving an employee 90% of their compensation as housing and calling it wages to avoid cash payouts or PF contributions.
Exactly. It ensures wages remain primarily monetary, while allowing some limited flexibility for benefits in kind.
Okay. All these precise inclusions, exclusions, and especially that powerful 50% rule, this must have a massive ripple effect throughout the entire compensation landscape.
No, absolutely. They fundamentally alter how employee salaries are structured and how long-term benefits are calculated. It's a sea change.
So let's talk about those ripples. What's one of the most immediate impacts for employees and employers?
One of the most immediate and significant impacts is on salary structure restructuring and, consequently, your take-home pay.
How so?
The Code on Wages, effectively through that 50% rule and the definition, now mandates that an employee's basic salary cannot be less than 50% of the company's cost to company, or CTC.
Right, that 50% floor for the wage component.
Exactly, and this is a truly significant departure from previous norms.
That's a huge change. Our sources emphasize this is a direct response to those past practices where companies deliberately kept basic pay low.
And inflated allowances to lower their PF and gratuity contributions.
Yeah. So what's the direct consequence of forcing that basic salary component higher?
The direct consequence is clear. A higher basic salary automatically means higher mandatory deductions for provident fund and gratuity.
Because those are calculated as a percentage of that basic wage. Right?
Precisely. So if your basic pay goes up, because it has to be at least 50% of CTC, your mandatory contributions to PF and gratuity also go up proportionally.
Which means for many employees, especially those whose companies previously had a very low basic pay component, their actual take-home salary, the net pay after all deductions, might actually decrease.
That's the potential immediate effect, yes. A larger portion of their CTC will now be allocated to that higher basic salary and those corresponding statutory deductions.
So less cash in hand each month.
Potentially, yes. This really presents a fascinating, almost philosophical trade-off.
For trade-off between what?
Between immediate income and long-term security. While there's a potential reduction in immediate take-home pay for some, it's a direct exchange for increased long-term savings and greater Social Security and retirement benefits.
So less now, but more later in PF and gratuity.
Exactly. For a young professional just starting out, that immediate reduction might feel like a significant hit, especially if they're focused on rent or loan repayments.
Yeah, you feel that immediately.
But for someone nearing retirement, it's likely a welcome boost to their nest egg, ensuring a more substantial payout later in life. It's a deliberate policy shift from immediate gratification towards long-term financial security.
A balancing act the code attempts to strike. Interesting. Okay, shifting gears slightly, let's look at dearness allowance, or DA. How do its adjustments work now? It's a core part of the wage definition.
Right, DA, as we mentioned, is that key component meant to offset inflation. It's typically revised twice a year.
When does that usually happen?
Usually before April 1st and October 1st. This regular adjustment mechanism is crucial. It compensates employees for changes in the cost of living index, ensuring their wages maintain purchasing power.
And we've seen recent examples of this, right? The government adjusts it for its employees.
Yes, the central government, for instance, announced a 4% DA increase in April 2025 for central employees. And that automatically led to a proportional increase in pensions for retirees, too.
And this ongoing need for DA adjustments is also fueling discussions about the next pay commission.
Exactly. Demands for the 8th Pay Commission to be implemented from January 2026 often cite the need to keep pace with inflation, which DA adjustments address regularly.
And these DA adjustments feed into minimum wages, too.
Absolutely. The latest minimum wage rates, effective October 1st, 2024, already incorporate these DA adjustments if you look at different skill levels.
Yes, give us some examples.
Okay, so for unskilled workers, it's around 783 per day. Semi-skilled, about 868. Skilled workers, 954 per day. And highly skilled, 135 per day. These rates reflect how DA adjustments directly impact the floor wage across different labor categories.
Got it. What about house rent allowance, HRA? We know it's excluded from the core wage definition now for statutory calculations, but what about its general purpose and tax implications? People still get HRA, right?
Oh yes, HRA is still very common, though not strictly mandatory for all employers. Its purpose is simply to help employees cover accommodation expenses in their city of work.
And it has tax benefits.
Yes, it comes with specific income tax exemptions. Typically, the lowest of 3 amounts is exempt. The actual HRA received 50% of basic salary for metro cities, 40% for non-metros, or the actual rent paid minus 10% of basic salary.
Okay, so the tax treatment is separate.
Correct. And as we highlighted, the key change under the code is its explicit exclusion from the core wages definition used for calculating things like Provident Fund. This forces the basic component higher, boosting those long-term benefit calculations.
Right. Okay, moving on to another big one, gratuity. This is a critical long-term benefit. How have the code and the new wage definition impacted its eligibility, calculation, and payment?
Gratuity is definitely affected, mostly in a positive way for employees due to the potentially higher wage base.
So first, just to be clear for everyone, what exactly is gratuity again?
Gratuity is essentially a lump sum payment. It's given by an employer to an employee in recognition of their long and faithful service to the company. Think of it as a thank you payment for loyalty.
And when is it typically paid?
It's typically payable upon specific events: resignation, dismissal, disability due to illness or accident, retirement, retrenchment, or if someone opts for a voluntary retirement scheme, VRS.
And what about eligibility? Do you need to work there for a certain time?
Yes, generally, eligibility requires an employee to complete at least 5 years of continuous service with that company.
5 years.
However, and this is important, that 5-year requirement is waived in cases of an employee's disability or death while in service. In those unfortunate circumstances, the gratuity becomes payable immediately to the employee or their nominee.
That's a crucial protection. How is it calculated? Is there a standard formula?
Yes, there's a very specific standard formula. It's number of years of service X, last drawn salary by 1526.
Okay, years X salary by 1526. And what does last drawn salary include here under the new code?
Crucially, under the new code, last drawn salary for gratuity explicitly includes both your basic pay and your dearness allowance.
So if the 50% rule has pushed your basic pay and DA higher, then your gratuity payout will likely be higher too, because it's based on that enhanced basic plus DA figure.
Can you give us a quick example? Make it concrete.
Sure. Let's say an employee worked for 10 years continuously. Their last drawn salary basic plus DA was $30,000 per month using the formula 10 years x 0,000 by 15, 26. That calculation comes out to a lump sum gratuity payment of approximately $1,073,076.
And employers have to pay that promptly.
Yes, legally mandated. They must pay it within 30 days of the employee's full and final settlement date. Any delays beyond that 30-day window attract simple interest, protecting the employee's right to timely payment.
Good to know. Okay, let's talk bonuses. Also affected by the new wage definition. What are the mandates here? Is there a minimum bonus?
Yes, this is another significant provision. The code makes it explicitly clear every employer, regardless of profit, must pay a minimum bonus. Regardless of profit. Really?
Regardless of whether the employer has an allocable surplus, basically, profit available for distribution in that accounting year. The minimum is 8.33% of the wages earned by the employee during the year, or 100, whichever amount is higher.
So even if the company has a tough year, that minimum bonus is still due.
That's the rule. It's a strong floor for bonus payments.
That sounds like a solid worker protection. Who is eligible?
Eligibility is quite broad. An employee simply needs to have worked for at least 30 days in that accounting year.
Just 30 days, that's a low threshold.
Very low, designed for wide coverage, and the payment must be made into the employee's bank account within 8 months of the accounting year's end.
8 months. Any exceptions?
Well, there are provisions for possible extensions up to 2 years, but only if approved by the appropriate government and for justifiable reasons.
Are there any situations where an employee might lose their right to a bonus? Be disqualified?
Yes, the code does outline specific disqualification conditions. An employee can be disqualified if they are terminated due to certain types of severe misconduct.
Such as?
Things like fraud, violent behavior on the premises, theft, misappropriation, or sabotage of company property. Also, if they are convicted for sexual harassment, serious breaches, basically.
Okay, that makes sense. Finally, let's touch upon working hours and overtime. These basic employment conditions are also part of these reforms, right?
Yes, streamlined and clarified.
So what are the standard maximum working hours now?
The code stipulates a maximum of 9 hours per day for normal work. This can be extended up to 12 hours, but importantly, that 12-hour limit must include designated rest periods.
So 12 hours including breaks, not 12 hours of pure work.
Correct. There are exceptions for very specific cases like intermittent work or emergencies where it could potentially go up to 16 hours, but those are rare scenarios.
And breaks are mandatory, right? You can't just work 9 hours straight.
Absolutely not. The code explicitly prohibits continuous work without a break for more than 5 hours.
So after 5 hours, you must get a break.
Yes. A mandatory half-hour break is required after 5 hours of continuous work. Ensures people get adequate rest.
How is overtime specifically defined now? When does it kick in?
Overtime is defined as any work exceeding those normal stipulated hours. The code gets quite specific, saying that working more than 15-20 minutes after 30 minutes of regular work counts as overtime.
Wow, that's precise. So even 20 minutes extra could trigger it.
Potentially, yes. And the compensation for overtime is also clear, typically paid at double the ordinary rate of wages.
Double pay for overtime.
Okay.
What about wrinkly rest? Is it fixed, like always Sunday?
Employees are legally entitled to 1 full day of rest per week, but there is some practical flexibility.
How so?
The rest day can be swapped with another day within a 5-day window, either before or after the original designated rest day, by mutual agreement usually.
But if you end up working on your rest day?
If an employee works on their designated rest day or the alternative rest day they agreed to, overtime wages are explicitly payable for that work. No free work on rest days.
Now, here's something intriguing our sources mention. It sounds almost futuristic. Could this code theoretically allow for, like, a 3-day work week?
Huh. Well, theoretically, yes. It seems possible under the framework.
How would that work?
While the code doesn't explicitly promote it, the structure allows for it. If employees work 12 hours a day...
Which is the maximum, including rest.
Right. If they work 12 hours a day for, say, 4 days, that would hit the 48-hour weekly limit. So yes, a 3-day week with 12-hour days might also fit within the 48-hour limit, provided the total weekly hours don't exceed 48 and there's a prior agreement.
So 12 hours a day, 4 days a week equals 48 hours. Or maybe 3 days if the total hours stayed under 48 somehow.
The key is the 48-hour weekly cap and the daily limits. It shows a certain degree of flexibility embedded within the framework, acknowledging that work patterns might evolve beyond the traditional 8-hour, 5-day model.
As long as the weekly limit is respected. Interesting. A nod to potentially different work structures.
Exactly. It's an attempt to accommodate evolving work models, though still with strict safeguards on total hours and daily limit.
Okay. This brings us nicely to the broader implications of all these labor reforms. We need to talk about the concerns people have raised and what this all means for the future of labor in India. It's definitely not a simple picture.
No, it's very complex, and it's vital to remember the Code on Wages is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Right, one of the 4 codes.
Exactly. It was enacted alongside the Industrial Relations Code, the Social Security Code, and the Occupational Safety, Health, and Working Conditions Code. Together, they represent this holistic attempt to modernize India's entire labor law framework.
And just to recap, the overarching goals of this massive 4-code reform, beyond just the wage definition. What was the bigger picture again?
The goals were really ambitious and far-reaching, primarily drastically reducing the sheer number of central labor laws from that bewildering 44 down to just these 4 streamlined codes.
Huge simplification.
Huge. The aim was to simplify the legal framework, reduce the multitude of definitions and regulatory bodies, make dispute resolution easier, and crucially, significantly enhance that ease of doing business in India.
Right, making India more attractive for investment in industry.
That was a major stated objective.
Okay, so simplification for businesses, potentially better protection for workers. Sounds like a win-win on paper. But like any major reform, these changes have faced significant criticisms and concerns. Let's get into those. What are some of the main worries about worker protections?
Well, despite the stated aims, some critics, particularly labor unions and worker advocacy groups, argue quite strongly that the new codes, taken together, actually give capitalists, quote, an open license to exploit workers.
Strong words. What's the basis for that claim?
It often points to things like the setting of what they see as a relatively low national floor wage, and also a perceived dilution of protections that were perhaps more robustly defined in the older separate acts. The argument is that consolidation might have sacrificed some specific protections for the sake of simplicity.
And we already talked about the take-home salary impact. The fact that some employees might see an immediate reduction in net pay due to higher PF and gratuity deductions.
Exactly. While it's framed as a long-term benefit, that immediate hit is a significant concern for many employees, especially those living paycheck to paycheck or with fixed financial commitments. It requires a real adjustment.
What about the unorganized sector? That's a huge part of India's workforce. Are they fully covered?
That's another major area of criticism. For example, the Occupational Safety, Health, and Working Conditions Code. Critics point out it applies mainly to factories employing more than 10 workers.
Only 10 or more?
Yes, which effectively leaves, by some estimates, around 90% of India's immense workforce, mostly in the unorganized sector, outside its direct purview.
Wow, 90% potentially left out of those specific OSH rules.
That's the criticism, that it weakens safety provisions for a huge segment of the labor force, leaving them vulnerable.
There are also concerns about the Social Security funds themselves, aren't there? Like merging EPF and ESI?
Yes, our sources mention definite suspicion and apprehension around the proposed consolidation of the Employees Provident Fund, EPF, and Employee State Insurance, ESI funds into a single unified fund.
What are the fears there?
Fears that workers' hard-earned money, safe for retirement and welfare, might be invested in more speculative stock markets, exposing it to greater risk than the current, more conservative investment strategies.
And what about pensions for the unorganized sector? Is that seen as fully workable?
Questions are definitely raised about the practical feasibility, especially considering average life expectancy trends and the fact that many proposed models rely on consistent self-contributions from workers rather than guaranteed employer contributions. That can be really challenging for people in precarious, low-income employment.
Trade union rights seem to be another really contentious area. What are the criticisms there?
Very contentious. Critics argue that the Industrial Relations Code, another one of the 4, makes strikes significantly more difficult.
Oh.
By imposing stricter notice periods and increasing the threshold for needing government permission to strike. Furthermore, it allows factories with up to 300 employees to implement arbitrary retrenchment, basically, laying off workers without needing prior government approval.
Up to 300 employees. That covers a lot of businesses.
It does. And the argument from unions is that this directly undermines workers' collective bargaining power and significantly complicates the formation and effective functioning of unions. It shifts the power balance further towards employers.
The adequacy of the floor wage itself has also been heavily debated, hasn't it? That Euro 178 per day figure.
Hugely debated. That announced national floor wage of 178 per day, while a legal baseline faced immediate and strong criticism.
Why? too low?
Critics argue it's significantly lower than recommendations from various expert committees and even the Seventh Pay Commission's calculations for a minimum wage. This disparity led to accusations that it amounts to a starvation-level wage rather than a genuine living wage. It raises fundamental questions about economic equity.
And then there's the whole challenge of the gig economy. How do these codes handle that? It's changing the nature of work so rapidly.
That's a massive challenge. The traditional employer-employee framework, which these new laws are largely built on, really struggles to classify and protect gig economy workers.
Because they're often seen as independent contractors.
Exactly. So they often lack the benefits and protections of traditional employment minimum wage, overtime, social security contributions, paid leave, etc.
Is India unique in facing this?
Not at all. It's a global challenge. We see places like California trying things like their 2019 bill, AB 5, attempting to reclassify certain independent contractors as employees to give them benefits. India's new codes are still grappling with how to integrate and protect this growing, very fluid segment of the workforce. Does the definition of wages even apply? Or do we need something entirely new?
Big questions. And finally, despite strong mechanisms like that 50% exclusion cap we talked about, are there still lingering concerns that employers might just find creative ways around the rules, new loopholes?
Absolutely. That concern definitely remains. Employers, often driven by cost pressures, might still try to find creative ways to structure pay.
Like inventing new allowance categories.
Potentially. Devising new allowance categories that aren't explicitly mentioned in the code's current list of exclusions. If these new categories fall outside the specified inclusions and exclusions, they could potentially allow employers to challenge the application of the 50% cap, or at least try to minimize its impact.
So it might require ongoing vigilance and maybe further updates.
It will likely be a constant cat and mouse game for enforcement, yes, requiring vigilance and possibly further regulatory clarifications down the line.
It's clear that international bodies, like the International Labor Organization, the ILO, play a big role in shaping these global discussions. What's their involvement here?
The ILO is a specialized agency of the UN. It's quite unique, actually. Its job is setting international labor standards, promoting social justice, and advocating for worker rights worldwide.
And they won a Nobel Peace Prize for it.
They did, back in 1969. Highlights their global impact.
What makes their structure unique?
It's their tripartite governance structure. It brings together representatives from governments, employers, and workers, usually in a 2.1:1 ratio, to discuss and agree on labor standards. It fosters dialogue.
So, how does India's reform relate to ILO recommendations? Does it align?
Well, India, as an ILO member state, considers ILO conventions and recommendations. However, critics argue that India's new codes don't fully align with all ILO recommendations.
Where's the main tension?
Often around the balance between employer flexibility, that ease of doing business's goal, versus the strength of worker bargaining rights and protections. This tension between global standards and national economic priorities is a persistent theme in labor law reform everywhere.
Okay. So with all these changes and complexities, how does the code actually plan to enforce everything? Ensure compliance on the ground? What are the mechanisms?
The code emphasizes moving towards more transparent and accountable inspection systems, trying to get away from potentially arbitrary inspections of the past. The Chief Labor Commissioner, Central, is responsible for formulating a comprehensive inspection scheme. This can include modern methods like electronic and web-based inspections.
Using technology for inspections.
Yes, and potentially using randomized selections for inspections, aiming to enhance fairness and reduce discretionary biases.
And what if an employee believes they haven't received their due wages or benefits under these new rules? What can they do?
They have recourse. Employees themselves, registered trade unions, or even this new role called an inspector-cum-facilitator.
Inspector-cum-facilitator. What's that?
It's a role introduced for oversight, but also meant to assist employers and employees with compliance. Anyway, any of these parties can file claims related to unpaid wages, bonuses, or other dues.
Is there a time limit for filing claims?
Yes, and crucially, the time limit seems to have been increased significantly. Sources suggest it's now 5 years from the date the claim arises. That's a much longer window for seeking redressal compared to some previous laws.
5 years gives people more time.
Definitely. Although it's worth noting, one source mentioned 3 years, so there might be some nuance or variation depending on the specific claim, but it's generally a longer period now.
What about penalties for employers who don't comply? Are there teeth in the law?
Yes, the code includes various penalties designed as deterrents. For a first offense of paying less than the due wages, employers can face fines up to $50,000.
And if they do it again,
Repeat offenses escalate significantly, potentially leading to imprisonment for up to 3 months and up substantially higher fines, possibly up to $100,000.
so serious consequences for repeat offenders.
Yes, and even just improper maintenance of records, which hinders transparency, can attract a $10,000 fine.
What happens if an employer deducts money from your pay, say for PF, but then doesn't actually deposit it? Who's responsible?
This is a critical protection for employees outlined clearly in the code. If an employer makes deductions but fails to deposit them,
Yeah.
such employee shall not be held responsible for such default of the employer.
So the responsibility is squarely on the employer. The employee is protected if the employer messes up the deposit.
Entirely. The onus and legal responsibility rests solely with the employer to ensure proper and timely deposit of all statutory deductions. The employee is shielded from negative consequences of the employer's negligence.
That's really important. And in a wage dispute, who has to prove what? Does the employee prove non-payment or does the employer prove payment?
The burden of proof lies squarely on the employer.
The employer has to prove they paid correctly.
Yes, they have to prove that all dues have been paid. This is a significant legal shift that generally favors the employee in wage recovery claims, as it's typically much harder for an employee to definitively prove non-payment than for an employer with records to prove payment.
Makes sense. What about contracting out? Can an employee sign away their rights under the code deed? Maybe in their employment contract?
No, absolutely not. The code is very clear on this. Any contract or agreement, written or implied, where an employee tries to relinquish or waive their right to any amount or bonus due under this code is explicitly declared null and void.
So you can't sign away your statutory rights.
Correct. This provision is critical. It ensures that the protections and benefits guaranteed by the code cannot be undermined or circumvented by private agreements. It safeguards the employee's fundamental rights.
And all of this, the simplification, the penalties, the burden of proof, it all plays back into that broader goal of ease of doing business, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Even with the criticism.
Yes, precisely. While aiming to strengthen worker protections, the reforms also explicitly aim to reduce compliance burdens for businesses.
How? Through simplification, mainly.
Through simplification of that fragmented legal landscape, yes. And also through a strategic move towards more self-certification, with inspections becoming more selective and risk-based, potentially randomized.
So less bureaucracy, ideally.
That's the underlying idea. Create a more predictable, less bureaucratic environment, making it easier for businesses to operate legally and efficiently. Of course, as we've discussed, that balance between easing things for business and ensuring robust worker protection remains a source of ongoing debate and scrutiny.
Wow, what an intricate journey we've taken today. We've really delved deep into India's code on wages 2019.
We certainly have.
We've seen how this landmark legislation, by bravely consolidating, what was it, nearly 30 fragmented labor laws?
29 central laws, yeah.
Right, how it's aiming to drastically simplify regulations and crucially expand essential protections to hundreds of millions of workers across India. That 500 million figure is just huge.
It's monumental in scope. And specifically, we've meticulously unpacked that intricate yet now unified definition of wages. We explored its core components like basic pay and DA.
We went through the long list of exclusions like HRA and overtime.
And crucially shone a bright light on that powerful 50% rule.
That really feels like the heart of it.
It really does. That rule, perhaps more than anything else, fundamentally reshapes how compensation structures have to be designed. It ensures that at least half of an employee's gross pay is considered for vital statutory benefits like Provident Fund and gratuity.
Truly impacting their long-term financial security.
Definitely.
And we've seen the cascading ripple effects this has had everywhere, from that fundamental restructuring of your potential take-home pay
to a significant reevaluation of how gratuity and bonus calculations are made.
and even clearer, maybe slightly more flexible, rules around working hours and overtime. It really is that complex trade-off, isn't it?
Thank you.
Potentially lowering immediate net pay for some.
but aiming for increased long-term Social Security and a more robust safety net for the workforce overall. That's the policy goal.
We also didn't shy away from the significant criticisms, though. The concerns about potentially reduced worker protections in some areas, the big debate around the adequacy of the national floor wage.
Which some critics called a starvation wage.
Right. And those profound challenges posed by integrating the vast unorganized sector and that rapidly burgeoning gig economy into this new framework.
It's definitely a complex picture. Many stakeholders, many competing interests, reflecting the dynamic, messy reality of economic and social policy.
So for you, our listener, whether you're an employee trying to finally decipher the nuances of your payslip, or maybe a business owner navigating these critical compliance changes.
A big task to them.
Or maybe you're just someone insanely curious about the foundational elements of our economy and how they're evolving. This deep dive should hopefully arm you with some essential knowledge.
Yeah, the goal is to help you look beyond just the final number in your salary.
Exactly. Understand its underlying components, its profound legal implications, and how it directly impacts your financial present and your future.
And this transformation is indeed far from over. Its full effects, the practical realities will continue to unfold over the coming years.
Yeah.
There will be teething problems, interpretations, maybe even legal challenges.
Absolutely. It's a living process. And that leads us perfectly to our provocative thought for you to ponder as we wrap up.
Okay.
Given this ongoing, very spirited debate between ease of doing business and worker protection that these comprehensive labor codes represent, how might India's labor landscape continue to evolve from here?
Good question.
Especially as new forms of employment like the gig economy we discussed become even more prevalent and really start to redefine those traditional work relationships.
Yeah, that's the huge unknown.
And what will that mean for the very definition of wages in the decades to come? Will this 2019 definition hold? Will it need to expand or adapt? Or will entirely new categories of compensation and benefits emerge?
Food for thought indeed, especially as the very nature of work itself transforms right before our eyes.
Lots to think about. Until next time, keep digging deeper. Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of information, distill it into the most important nuggets, and help you become well-informed fast. Today we're plunging into a monumental shift in India's labor landscape. The Code on Wages 2019, this isn't just another new law, it's a massive consolidation of decades of legislation aiming to redefine how millions of people are paid and, well, how businesses operate. For years, India's labor laws were, frankly, a complex, fragmented web. We're talking 29 different acts. As many of you might know, this often created more confusion than clarity, both for employers and, critically, it left a vast number of unorganized workers pretty vulnerable. So the mission of this deep dive is to unpack this ambitious reform. We want to understand its core components, its intended benefits, and also the significant challenges and criticisms it still faces. To do this, we've gone through a diverse stack of sources. We've got excerpts directly from the Code on Wages 2019 itself, some internal HR manuals, articles from legal and industry publications like Legal Industry Magazine, and analyses from leading consulting firms and academic journals too.
We've also included notes on key figures and public discussions around the code, just so you get the full picture. Okay, so with that foundational understanding of India's complex labor history, let's now peel back the layers. Let's understand what this grand consolidation, the Code on Wages, actually is. This is the first of 4 new labor codes passed by the Indian government. It's a truly massive undertaking, really, to simplify regulations across the board.
It really is. And what's fascinating here is how it consolidates and replaces 4 really crucial existing laws that have been pillars for a very long time. You've got the Payment of Wages Act from 36, the Minimum Wages Act 48, Payment of Bonus Act 65, and the Equal Remuneration Act from 1976. The stated objectives are pretty clear: reduce complexity, cut down on litigation, and make compliance significantly easier for businesses. It's about trying to create a more predictable labor environment.
Right, so bringing order to what was, let's face it, a rather chaotic system. Now, a crucial question. Who exactly does this impact? Is it just for big corporations, or is it truly far-reaching?
Oh, the scope is truly universal, and that's one of its most important features, really key. Unlike many of the older laws, which were often limited, to specific types of establishments or scheduled employments, the code aims to extend minimum wage protection, timely payments, and other benefits to all workers across India. And that includes both the organized sector and, crucially, the previously underserved unorganized sectors. We're talking about an impact on approximately 500 million workers.
500 billion.
Wow, it's huge. And it also explicitly promotes gender pay equality, prohibiting discrimination in recruitment, promotion, transfer. That's a significant step towards, well, economic justice.
Universal coverage sounds incredibly ambitious and definitely a positive step on paper. But, in a country as diverse as India, with such a vast informal sector, what are the most immediate practical hurdles to truly extending these protections to every single worker?
Yeah, that's a critical point. While the intent is universal, the big practical hurdle lies in enforcement and awareness, especially in those micro and unorganized sectors where formal record keeping is minimal or non-existent sometimes. It requires a monumental shift in compliance culture, coupled with robust inspector-cum-facilitator mechanisms to actually reach those previously outside the formal safety net. The code lays the groundwork, sure, but the real work is on the ground, getting it done.
Okay, now let's get down to the brass tacks, what everyone truly wants to know. How does this new code fundamentally redefine wages? And perhaps more importantly, what does that mean for your actual take-home salary and, your future financial planning? Historically, that definition has been quite fluid, all right.
You're absolutely right. Historically, the definition of wages varied significantly across different labor acts, like the Employee Provident Fund, the EPF Act, defined wages differently from the Employee State Insurance, or ESI Act. So the new code, it provides a single, uniform definition across all these consolidated laws, much clearer. It explicitly includes your basic pay, dearness allowance DA, and retaining allowance. Even something called special allowance is generally included in this definition, unless it's very explicitly excluded in your employment terms. The goal is greater clarity, less litigation.
So we have this clear, uniform definition. Okay, but what about those other common components, things like house rent allowance, HRA, overtime, employer contributions to Provident Fund, PFEF? Are they just excluded, or is there a hidden twist in how the code treats them, something that could significantly impact someone's salary structure?
This is where the really profound implication lies. Yes. While components like HRA, overtime allowance, commission, and employer contributions to PFE are still generally excluded from that core definition of wages, there's a critical new rule. The sum of these excluded components, basically, all allowances not considered part of the core wage, cannot be more than 50% of your total remuneration, or your cost to company, your CTC. What this means is your basic salary and dearness allowance combined must constitute at least 50% of your CTC.
Okay, hold on. So this isn't just a minor tweak. This sounds like a fundamental rewiring of how companies structure compensation. What does this all mean for you, the employee? What's the real ripple effect on your paycheck and your savings?
Well, for many, it means a potentially higher basic salary than what they might have had before, especially in companies that, previously structured salaries with a very low basic and lots of allowances. This higher basic directly translates to increased contributions to your Provident Fund, your PF, and your gratuity. So it boosts your long-term savings for retirement and other benefits. It's almost like a forced savings plan in a way. The company's contributing more to your long-term security.
Okay, so better long-term savings.
Exactly. However, while that's great for future financial security, it can also lead to a slight reduction in your immediate take-home salary. Why? Because a larger chunk of your CTC is now statutorily deducted and directed towards those long-term savings. And from the employer side, well, this higher basic wage mandate can mean an extra burden for their PF contributions. It forces companies to commit a larger fixed portion of their CTC to core wages, sort of curtailing that allowance culture many use to manage costs.
Right. Let's shift gears slightly. Let's talk about the absolute floor minimum wages. This has always been a contentious area, hasn't it? This idea of a national floor wage sounds like a powerful tool. But was there much debate or contention around the actual number initially proposed?
Oh, there absolutely was. A lot of debate. The code empowers the central government to set this national floor wage, which acts as a crucial baseline. No state government can fix its minimum wages below this floor. The calculation criteria for this are actually quite detailed. They consider factors like 3 adult consumption units per family. You can think of it as a baseline for a small family's essential needs, maybe couple and a child, or even 3 independent adults. It also factors in a daily intake of 2,700 calories per unit, specific percentages for rent, about 10%, fuel and electricity at 20%, and then another 25% for education, medical needs, contingencies, that sort of thing. There was even an expert committee that suggested increasing the consumption units to 3.6 per family.
I remember some significant criticism when the initial floor wage was announced. What was the core of that debate? Well, what was the figure?
Right. So the Labor and Employment Minister at the time, Santosh Kumar Gangwar, announced a daily minimum floor wage of $178. And that drew significant criticism from various quarters. Experts, even the government's own economic survey, had recommended substantially higher amounts. The recommendations ranged from $9,750 to $11,622 per month, or some unions were pushing for $18,000 per month. So this contentious floor wage debate, it really reveals a deeper philosophical tug-of-war within the code itself. Is it primarily a tool for ease of doing business, attracting investment, or is its core mission genuine worker upliftment and a real push towards a true living wage? The figure proposed, 178, suggested to many critics that, well, the former was currently holding sway.
Interesting tension there. So we've covered the monetary shifts, the wages, the minimum floor. But the code isn't just about what hits your bank account. It also reaches into the fabric of your daily working life, from the hours you put in to how your breaks and holidays are structured. What are the key changes here?
That's right. It touches on the day-to-day. It sets a maximum of 9 working hours per day, generally, though this can be extended up to 12 hours, including rest time, or even 16 hours for specific intermittent or emergency work situations. Critically, though, no employee can work continuously for more than 5 hours without a mandatory 30-minute break. That's aimed at ensuring adequate rest and preventing worker fatigue, a crucial protection.
Okay, a mandatory break. And what about the work week itself? Is it still a standard 5 or 6 days, or is there more flexibility now?
The standard remains 48 hours per week, with a mandatory weekly rest day for every employee who has worked at least 6 days. That part's familiar. However, it introduces some significant flexibility. If an employee and the company mutually agree, a 12-hour workday could allow for a 3-day work week with 3 consecutive days off. So effectively, the traditional 9 to 5, it's getting a potential overhaul, allowing for both more extended workdays and possibly even compressed work weeks.
That compressed week option. For a small business owner, that flexibility must be incredibly appealing. But how do you think it truly impacts employee well-being over time? Those longer days.
That's an interesting tension, isn't it? The potential for flexibility versus the long-term impact of extended days. It's something to watch. The code also seems to be making a particularly notable change regarding women in the workplace, moving away from some long-standing restrictions. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, that's a really important point.
This relaxation of working hour restrictions for women is quite a landmark move. Previously, many acts mandated restrictions on women working, say, before 6 a.m. or after 7 p.m., especially in certain types of establishments. The new code relaxes this. It allows women to work in all types of businesses, provided, of course, their safety and working conditions are ensured. This is a big step towards greater gender inclusivity, equal employment opportunities, opening up sectors and shifts that were previously difficult or impossible for women to access. There's also an amendment removing the requirement for a shop or establishment to be closed for one specific day per week. This allows employers to potentially function round the clock with rotating weekly holidays for employees. Again, a move towards a greater business flexibility.
Okay. Looking beyond the immediate salary and hours, the code also streamlines provisions for crucial long-term benefits, like gratuity and bonus. It offers clearer guidelines for both employers and employees. How did these changes affect these vital components of a worker's overall compensation package?
Right. Gratuity first. The general rule of 5 years of continuous service for eligibility, that largely remains. Though, importantly, this requirement is waived in cases of disability or death, which is a fair protection. Gratuity is calculated based on your years of service and your last drawn salary, specifically your basic pay plus dearness allowance. So, for example, an employee, let's call him Shri Hemant, who worked for 10 years with a last drawn salary of $30,000 basic plus DA, that specific figure would be used for their calculation. And importantly, employers are now mandated to pay gratuity within 30 days of an employee's final settlement. If there's a delay, simple interest accrues on the delayed payment. That adds a layer of protection for the worker and, disincentivizes delays from the employer side.
Good to have that clarity in the penalty for delay. And what about bonus payments? Especially for those in smaller companies or industries that might not always turn a huge profit, does the code offer new protections there?
It does, and this is significant. The code mandates a minimum bonus of 8.33% of wages earned, or 100, whichever is higher. And critically, this applies regardless of whether the employer actually made a profit or had what's called an allocable surplus. This provides a significant safety net. To be eligible, an employee needs to have worked for at least 30 days in that accounting year. The code also outlines clear grounds for disqualification, things like proven fraud, violent conduct on premises, theft, or sexual harassment. And bonuses are now generally to be paid directly into the employee's bank account within 8 months of the accounting year's end, though there are provisions for extensions up to 2 years under specific circumstances.
Okay, so clearer rules, minimum guarantees. But while the code promises simplification and universal coverage, we know it hasn't been smooth sailing. It's faced challenges, criticisms, especially regarding its actual implementation on the ground. What's standing in the way of this grand vision actually becoming reality everywhere?
Yeah, that's a key question, the implementation gap. It has faced significant delays, largely because state governments are still in the process of framing and notifying their respective rules under the code. This leads to a frustrating lack of uniformity across India. It creates this sort of regulatory limbo. And there's also been considerable resistance from various stakeholders, including trade unions concerned about worker rights, and also some employers cautious about compliance costs and the adjustments required.
What are some of the main concerns being raised by critics, particularly those advocating for stronger worker protections? What are they pointing to?
Well, critics argue that despite the stated benefits of simplification, the new code might, in practice, lead to reduced worker protections overall. Some have suggested it gives capitalists, and I'm quoting here, an open license to exploit workers, particularly by setting that national floor wage relatively low, as we discussed. There are also concerns about the consolidation of Social Security funds, with fears that workers' hard-earned money might be invested in speculative stock markets. And then there are questions about the feasibility of pension schemes for unorganized workers, mainly due to the requirement for consistent contributions from the workers themselves, which can be really challenging given their often inconsistent earnings.
Right, that consistency is tough in the informal sector. I understand trade union rights are also a particularly contentious point in these broader reforms, often seen as a critical lever for worker power. What's the core of that critique?
Yes, the Associated Industrial Relations Code Bill, which is one of the other 4 codes, is heavily criticized. Critics say it makes strikes more difficult by introducing longer notice periods for public utility services. And it allows factories with up to 300 employees more flexibility for arbitrary retrenchment layoffs without needing government permission. This threshold was lower before. Some view this as a direct attack on workers' collective bargaining rights and their ability to form effective trade unions, essentially shifting the balance of power more towards employers.
So a potential weakening of collective bargaining.
That's the concern. On the business side, though, while the number of compliance returns has indeed been reduced significantly from 10 down to just 2, which is simpler, that higher basic wage mandate, the 50% rule, could mean an extra burden for employers regarding their provident fund contributions. However, to balance things, enforcement mechanisms are meant to be bolstered. You have the introduction of these inspector-cum-facilitators, who are supposed to advise as well as inspect, and there are enhanced penalties for non-compliance, including potentially hefty fines and even imprisonment for repeat offenses. So it's really a mixed bag of pros and cons, depending heavily on your perspective.
A complex balancing act indeed. And finally, looking ahead, there's this push for an entirely new pay structure on the horizon, sort of independent of these code on wages discussions. How does this demand for an 8th pay commission fit into the broader landscape of wage reform in India?
That's a crucial long-term consideration, absolutely. Various central government employee organizations and unions are consistently pushing for a new pay commission, the 8th pay commission, to be set up and implemented, ideally by January 2026. Their core argument is that mere dearness allowance increases, which are meant to offset inflation, are just insufficient given the rising cost of living and actual inflation experienced on the ground. They believe a new pay commission would provide better protection from the effects of inflation and bring about a fundamental change in salary structures, one that genuinely reflects current economic realities. This definitely raises an important question about how the Code on Wages, with its floor wage and definitions, will adapt and interact with these broader economic pressures and the continuous demand for a truly living wage that keeps pace with inflation over time.
Right, so we've taken a pretty deep dive into India's Code on Wages 2019. It's clearly a landmark reform designed to simplify decades of convoluted laws, ensure fairer compensation, and promote gender equality. We've seen how it fundamentally redefines wages, sets those minimum standards, reshapes working hours with some flexibility, and clarifies crucial long-term benefits like gratuity and bonus.
And if we try to connect this to the bigger picture, it's clear the code aims to modernize India's labor landscape. It's an attempt to foster, a more predictable environment for businesses while also extending basic protections to a vast, previously underserved workforce. However, as we've discussed, the ongoing debates, the implementation challenges, they really highlight highlight the complex balancing act. It's between employer flexibility and ensuring robust worker protections, especially for those millions in the vast unorganized sector. The path ahead, it really requires coordinated efforts between the center and states, and likely ongoing adjustments as things evolve.
So here's something to think about. As India strives toward this goal of a living wage by 2025 and grapples with these extensive reforms, how effectively will the Code on Wages truly bridge the gaps in worker protection, especially for the most vulnerable? And what will be the ultimate long-term impact on the daily lives and financial security of its millions of diverse workers?